You know, usually when we build a monument to a historical figure, there's this, like, expectation of solid marble perfection.
Right, like architecture.
Yeah, exactly, like architecture. You carve the statue, the plaque lists the dates and all the noble deeds, and society just kind of points and says, there it is. That's exactly who they were.
It's clean.
Right. It's super clean, a flawless hero, or, I don't know, a clear-cut villain.
And it's comforting, too. Like, our history to be visible, to be easily categorized into, like, good and bad. We want the narrative to be simple so we can just digest it and move on.
Right. But then, you step into the world of 19th century American literature, right into the bleeding trauma of the Civil War, and suddenly that pristine marble monument just, boy, it shatters completely.
It really does.
Because today, we are looking at Walt Whitman, the so-called good gray poet, the grandfatherly figure of American literature.
Right, the guy with the beard.
Yeah, the beard. But we are also looking at a man who stood over the mass graves of the Civil War, looked at the bloodiest ideological conflict in American history, and, like, tried to convince the country to simply, to forget it ever happened.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. How does the ultimate poet of democracy, a man who claimed to speak for every single soul, end up erasing the very people he claimed to champion? That is the contradiction we are unpacking for you today.
Yeah.
We are taking you straight to the core of a towering yet highly contradictory cultural figure.
And I mean, it is a massive undertaking.
Oh, huge.
To really understand Whitman, you have to bypass the high school textbook version of him. The friendly guy who just really loved nature and equality.
Right, the sanitized version.
Exactly. We have to dive into the intricate mechanics of his poetry, contemporary posthumanist critiques, the deeply traumatic historical context of his Civil War years, and, well, his incredibly complex, sometimes highly problematic political and racial legacy.
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack his radical vision of the democratic soul, explore how the unprecedented trauma of the American Civil War completely shattered and reshaped his worldview, and specifically examine how he managed to reconcile, like, the unspeakable horrors of war with profound concepts of beauty.
Right.
And we have to start with the language itself, because before Whitman comes along in the 1850s, American poetry was basically just British poetry in a different time zone.
It really was. I mean, in the mid-19th century, the American literary landscape was heavily defined by the genteel tradition of New England.
Right.
It was entirely derivative. American poets were essentially wearing the straitjacket of traditional British prosody.
Okay, let's pause there and unpack that a little bit. What exactly makes it a straitjacket?
Well, British poetry at the time relied on strict accentual syllabic meter.
Okay.
Think of it like a metronome or highly rigid sheet music. Every line has a very specific assigned number of syllables, and the emphasis has to fall on very specific beats.
Like dadum dan 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 deen.
Exactly. Neat rhymes, polite subjects, highly structured forms like sonnets. It's beautiful, sure, but it's aristocratic by design.
Oh, I see.
It demands compliance to a pre-existing rule book. You can't step out of line.
And Whitman looks at this and basically says, this doesn't fit us at all.
Precisely. Whitman fundamentally believed that America could only become a true functional democracy if it developed an entirely original national literature.
Right, because the old forms don't match the new reality.
Exactly. He felt that you could not express the chaotic, sprawling, diverse reality of a new democracy using the rigid, aristocratic literary forms of the very empire you just fought a revolution against to escape.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. He wrote in his 1871 essay, Democratic Vistas, that the priest departs, the divine literatus comes.
The divine literatus. I mean, that is quite a title to give yourself.
It's an incredibly bold statement, right?
Yeah.
But it reveals his core philosophy. He believed the poet was becoming the secular spiritual leader of a democratic age. The old religious hierarchies and the old political hierarchies were fading, and the poet, the literatus, was going to step in to spiritually unify the people.
Wow.
But to capture this, like, limitless American self, to capture the industrial noise of the cities, the immense geographic expansion out west, the sheer diversity of the democratic experience, he needed a completely new form.
So he essentially invents American free verse. And this is crucial for you listening. It wasn't just him being, lazy about rhyming or not knowing how to write a sonnet.
Right, not at all.
It was a highly sophisticated language experiment. He's pulling from all these uniquely American and historical sounds, like the cadences of the King James Bible.
Yes, huge influence.
The rhetorical flourishes of politicians giving speeches on tree stumps. The natural rhythmic patterns of human breath. He used syntactic parallelism, these massive sprawling catalogs listing every profession he could think of, and rhetorical repetition, things like anaphora, where you repeat the beginnings of lines over and over to build this hypnotic momentum.
Yes, absolutely. His poetic form is his political theory.
Wow.
You cannot separate the two. By abandoning strict meter, he created a framework that perfectly mirrored his democratic ideals.
That's fascinating.
In a manuscript note from 1872, Whitman actually described his verse as a loose and free meter, fitfully rising and falling.
Fitfully rising and falling.
Yeah, he compared it to ocean waves on the shore. Sometimes you get a massive, rhythmic, crashing wave, and sometimes it's just a weak, chaotic, unpredictable splash.
I love that image. And it makes so much sense when you actually try to read his work aloud. Like, it reminds me of the rhythmic analysis and the sources regarding the very first poem in Leaves of Grass, Oneself I Sing.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. The analysis points out that Whitman deliberately oscillates between giving you a strong, comforting rhythm and then suddenly just, like, pulling the rug out from under you.
She really does.
Like, the first line is, Oneself I Sing, a simple, separate person. It has this strong, comforting, almost recognizable 5-beat rhythm. It lulls you in.
Yeah, very traditional sounding.
But then, by the third line, he throws in the word physiology. He says, of physiology from top to toe I sing.
And that word single-handedly destroys any attempt to read the poem like a traditional British sonnet.
Right, because imagine trying to read the word physiology to the beat of Mary Had a Little Lamb.
You can't.
You'd have to force it so hard. You'd be sitting there reciting of Physiology I sing.
Exactly. It sounds totally unnatural.
It sounds ridiculous. It forces you to stop the mental metronome and just speak like a normal human being giving a speech. You have to rely on your own natural intonation.
And that forced choice is the entire point of his project.
Really?
Yes. By making you stumble, by forcing you to figure out how to say the word naturally within the line, Whitman is breaking the passive relationship between the poet and the audience.
Oh, wow.
He's demanding your democratic participation.
It's basically like open source software.
Huh. Yeah, I like that.
No, think about it. Strict British meter is like proprietary code. It's locked down by the developer, it runs exactly one way, and you, the user, just sit back and consume it.
Right.
But Whitman created an open framework. The user, you, the reader, has to actively negotiate how to read the line, how to compile the code in real time, depending on your own breath and your own natural speaking voice. You are participating in the creation of the rhythm.
That is a brilliant analogy. The reader becomes a co-creator.
Exactly.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture of his philosophy, Whitman was directly pushing back against some of the dominant intellectual thinkers of his day.
Like who?
Specifically, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, Emerson was a huge influence on Whitman.
Right, they wrote letters to each other.
They did. But Emerson tended to divide the world into the spiritual me and the physical not me. Emerson's approach was highly intellectual.
Okay.
He wanted to spiritually unify things that were physically disparate, essentially prioritizing the mind and the soul over the messy physical reality of the body.
But Whitman wasn't having that separation at all.
Not even a little bit.
Whitman insisted that the body and the soul were inextricably linked and absolutely equally divine. I mean, he proudly called himself the poet of the body and the soul.
He really did.
There's that famous line in the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass where he writes, "Divine am I inside and out. The scent of these armpits is aroma finer than prayer."
Which, as you can imagine, was incredibly shocking to polite society at the time.
I mean, yeah, to compare the smell of armpits to a holy prayer, that was borderline blasphemous.
Totally. But for Whitman, you simply could not have political equality without spiritual and physical equality.
Oh, that's interesting.
He looked around at a country divided by physical conditions, gender, race, the grueling manual labor of different occupations, and he leveled the playing field by stating that every single part of the human body and every type of physical person is a literal miracle.
So if Whitman truly believed every single human body was equally divine, regardless of class or race, he had to figure out why. Like, where does that absolute equality come from?
Right.
And his answer wasn't just a political philosophy. It was deeply biological. He looked at the physical environment. He looked at the dirt. Which brings us to a really fascinating modern lens on his work. Eco-materialism.
Yes. Today, scholars actually recognize Whitman as a proto-eco-poet.
A proto-eco-poet,
Yeah, long before the modern environmental movement, he completely rejected the anthropocentric worldview.
meaning the human-centered view. The idea that humans are like the main characters of the universe and everything else is just background scenery.
Exactly. He rejected that entirely in favor of a biocentric worldview. He conceptually collapsed the boundaries between the physical human body and the more than human world, the plants, the animals, the soil.
There's this concept discussed in the material called transcorporeality.
Yes, crucial concept.
It's a bit of a dense term, but basically, instead of humans walking on top of the earth as visitors, Whitman is saying we are physically leaking into the environment, and the environment is leaking into us.
Right, it's a two-way street.
We aren't separate from nature at all. We are a porous system. We are literally made of the same atoms as the dirt.
Exactly.
Nature isn't just a pristine painting to be admired from afar, or like a dark wilderness to be conquered. The human body is entirely intermeshed with it.
And this profound ecological view was the very fuel for his democratic ideals.
How so?
Well, if all matter is connected, if, as he writes, the moth and the fish eggs are in their place just as the suns are in their place, then human hierarchies based on class, region, or occupation are not just politically wrong.
Right.
They are artificially imposed and fundamentally absurd in the face of nature. We are all made of the exact same cosmic compost.
Okay, I have to jump in here and push back on this, though.
Go for it.
Because if Whitman sees everything as this beautiful, interconnected cosmic soup, doesn't that risk totally ignoring the very real, very ugly social boundaries that were actively tearing the country apart in the 1850s?
It absolutely does.
I mean, if I'm enslaved in the South or working in a brutally dangerous factory in the North, it doesn't really help me to hear that I'm made of the same cosmic compost as the politician making the laws. Isn't his cosmic equality actually just a form of avoidance?
That is the critical tension of his antebellum work. And it's a very, very valid critique. He is mapping this cosmic biological equality onto a nation that is legally, systematically, and violently enforcing horrific inequality.
Right.
We see this acutely in Song of Myself, where he writes that the grass is a uniform hieroglyphic that grows equally among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff.
Right, he's basically saying the grass doesn't care who you are, it grows for everyone.
Exactly. But as later poets like William Carlos Williams noted in the 20th century, there is a serious flaw in this ecopoetics.
Okay.
Williams, who was updating Whitman's vision for a more industrialized age, recognized that Whitman operated under a slightly naive, de-sick belief in the environment's unlimited capacity to self-correct.
Oh, I see.
Whitman saw nature passively receiving whatever humanity left behind, including our bodies when we die, and always being able to regenerate it into something beautiful like grass.
He thought it was just an endless cycle of beauty.
Yes. And he applied this exact same logic to the country's political problems. He had this profoundly optimistic belief that social disaster could be avoided through personal bonding and cosmic communion.
Wow.
He really thought that if Americans could just read his poetry and see their shared biological divinity, the political dissension over slavery and states' rights in the 1850s would just magically dissolve.
But that beautiful, optimistic vision of an unbroken cosmic and national body was about to violently collide with the bloodiest reality imaginable.
Absolutely.
Because the uniform hieroglyphic of the grass is about to be soaked in blood. The Civil War erupts.
And this is the crucible that tests absolutely everything Whitman believed. The outbreak of the war in 1861 completely shatters his antebellum optimism.
He had to.
It leads to his poetry collection Drum Taps, published in 1865, which stands as a staggering historical and emotional document of a man's worldview being ground to dust and completely rebuilt.
If you read his early letters and his early war poems, it's actually shocking. He initially welcomed the war.
He did.
He had this intense, jingoistic, almost militaristic enthusiasm. In poems like First O Songs for a Prelude, he viewed the coming war as a purifying necessity. He literally welcomed it with open arms.
Yeah.
He thought it was going to be a quick, glorious clash that would wipe away the political rot and reaffirm the greatness of the Union.
And honestly, it was a surprisingly common sentiment at the start of the war on both sides.
Really?
Oh, yeah. This naive belief that a swift, decisive conflict would clear the air like a thunderstorm, but then reality hits.
Right.
In late 1862, Whitman reads in a newspaper casualty list that his brother George was wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Whitman immediately travels south to the front lines to find him, and what he witnessed there, and subsequently in Washington, D.C., changed the trajectory of his life and his art forever.
He finds his brother, who thankfully survived with a relatively minor wound, but Whitman stays. He ends up volunteering in the hastily constructed wooden military hospitals in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And we aren't talking about modern sterile hospitals here. These were overcrowded, disease-ridden pavilions filled with the screams of unanesthetized surgeries.
Is horrific.
He spent years there visiting tens of thousands of wounded and dying soldiers. He brought them fruit, wrote letters home for them, held their hands as they passed.
Yeah.
And suddenly, his grand, abstract concept of a unified body politic becomes terrifyingly literal.
Oh, completely.
He's no longer philosophizing about the perfection of the human form,
Yeah.
He is looking at the amputated limbs of teenagers piled up outside surgical tents. He is seeing the mangled and brutalized bodies in the very democratic citizens he sang about.
The daily, relentless proximity to that level of suffering and death served as a brutal, unrelenting stress test for his entire philosophy.
It must have.
Think about it. How does a poet whose entire worldview is fundamentally based on the absolute physical perfection and divinity of the human body process, a society that is actively slaughtering itself on an industrial scale?
Yeah. How do you reconcile that?
Exactly. How do you sing the praises of the body electric when that body is being blown apart by cannon fire?
It fundamentally changed the war poem as a genre, too. He completely eschewed heroic memorialization.
He really did.
He stopped writing grand, romanticized tales of generals on horseback leading glorious charges. He realized that the real war was happening in the cots.
Yes.
He focused entirely on the tragic, deeply intimate loss of the common soldier and the gory, horrific reality of the medical tents.
We see this vividly in his masterpiece from that era, The Wound Dresser. The imagery is completely unflinching.
It's hard to read.
He doesn't look away from the horror. He describes moving from cot to cot, dressing a crushed head, dealing with the stench of clotted rags and blood, and watching a young cavalryman die with a bullet hole straight through his neck.
Wow.
He explicitly tells the reader that his latest and deepest memories of the war are not of patriotic victories, but of the quiet, desperate acts of bearing bandages, water, and a sponge to dying boys.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. There is a line where he writes, "I could not refuse this moment to die for you if that would save you." He's desperately trying to absorb the pain of the entire nation into his own physical body. But confronted with this unimaginable scale of suffering, hundreds of thousands dead,
Yeah.
the entire landscape, scarred Whitman had to find a way to metabolize the trauma.
He had to.
He couldn't just leave it at the gore. If he did, he would have broken completely.
He couldn't. The trauma was far too immense to just document. To survive it intellectually and spiritually, he had to look beyond the immediate visceral politics of the war. He began seeking a cosmic mechanism that could somehow wash away the horror and make philosophical sense of the unprecedented carnage.
And here's where things get really complex.
Right.
And where we hit the absolute core of our deep dive today.
Yeah, this is the crux of it.
How does he reconcile this mass slaughter with his belief in a divine, beautiful universe? We have to look specifically at his poem titled, appropriately, Reconciliation.
Right.
And in it, he makes a daring, almost inherently contradictory claim. He fully acknowledges that the war is a horror of carnage. But then he explicitly calls the fact that it will eventually be forgotten beautiful.
The opening lines are breathtaking in their audacity. Word overall, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost.
Beautiful. He uses the word beautiful.
He does. He takes the concepts of time and death and personifies them as two patient cosmic sisters, death and night. And he says these sisters incessantly softly wash again and ever again this soiled world.
Wait, I have to pause here because this is a deeply uncomfortable concept.
Oh, very much so.
If we call the ultimate erasure of war beautiful, aren't we giving humanity a massive, unearned free pass?
That's the question.
If time just washes away all the carnage like rain washing dirt off a sidewalk, what holds the architects of that carnage accountable? What happens to justice? Is Whitman confusing the concept of profound moral reconciliation with simple amnesia?
That is the exact intentional discomfort Whitman injects into the poem.
Oh, he knew what he was doing.
Absolutely. By framing the sisters' death and night not as triumphant, terrifying victors, but as gentle, impersonal, almost apathetic, cleaners, he is suggesting a very dark underlying truth about history.
Which is?
He's suggesting that humanity's deepest, most blood-soaked stains aren't actually removed by sudden moral awakenings, or by signing peace treaties, or even by achieving justice.
Right.
They are removed by the slow, inevitable, relentless erosion of time. Eventually, everyone involved dies, and the earth reclaims the battlefields.
That is incredibly bleak when you really sit with it.
It is.
The washing is repetitive and quiet. Calling it a soiled world reduces the catastrophic ideological war to just like dirt ground into the planet. It's almost a nihilistic surrender to time.
But Whitman doesn't let the poem simply float away into that cold cosmic abstraction.
Thank goodness.
Right. He doesn't let us off the hook that easily. After looking up at the sky and the vastness of time, he brings this massive, sweeping concept of reconciliation crashing back down to the most intimate, shocking, and uncomfortable human scale imaginable.
The climax of the poem.
Yes.
The speaker's looking down into a coffin, and he leans over and kisses the white face of his dead enemy. He declares, "For my enemy is dead, a man divine as myself is dead."
It is a profound, incredibly challenging moment of empathy. He is forcing you, the reader, to hold two totally contradictory facts in your mind at the exact same moment.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the socially constructed role of enemy, a relationship built entirely by the mechanics of war, roles assigned by generals, hatred trained into the soldiers.
Right, the political reality.
Exactly. And second, you have the deeper, undeniable biological and spiritual truth of shared divinity.
Wow.
Reconciliation in this specific moment isn't a political agreement or a treaty. It is the recognition of shared human worth at the exact moment when revenge is no longer possible because the man is dead.
It's beautiful on a personal level, but we really have to look at the post-war reality of this worldview because this beautiful sentiment has a deeply problematic dark side when applied to a whole nation.
It really does.
Whitman had this fierce, desperate desire to reunite the North and the South after the war. The trauma of the hospitals made him crave peace above all else.
Yeah.
And to achieve that peace, to foster that reconciliation, he essentially started intentionally erasing the core ideological cause of the war, which was slavery.
Right.
He traded the messy, demanding truth of racial justice for a nostalgic, white-centric brotherhood.
This is where the deep historical analysis becomes absolutely crucial. There's an intense ongoing debate among scholars regarding the specific repetition of the phrase whiteface in the poem Reconciliation.
Okay.
Why does Whitman explicitly emphasize the whiteface in the coffin twice in 2 lines?
Right, because in poetry, especially with someone like Whitman, repetition is never an accident.
Never.
So, perspective 1, which is argued by historians like David Blight, says this repetition is an explicit, intentional act of racial erasure.
Yes.
It's Whitman betraying the black population, the newly freed slaves, in order to forge a virtual kinship between white Northerners and white Southerners. As if Whitman is saying, look, we were all white brothers in the end. Let's forget the dark-faced folks we were fighting over and just hug and move on.
It's a retreat into a homogenous, comfortable white nation, and we see this explicitly play out in his post-war prose piece, Democratic Vistas, written around 1871.
Right.
In that essay, he deliberately isolates the concept of the secession slave power from any actual geographical region. He talks about the nation as if all Americans are inherently peaceable and good-natured, completely ignoring the ongoing, brutal, systemic violence of Reconstruction happening in the South at that exact moment.
I look at it like a family dynamic.
Oh, how so?
It's like two brothers having a violently destructive brawl that burns down the family house.
Okay.
And then, standing in the ashes, they decide to make up by hugging each other while completely ignoring the people they have locked in the basement who actually started the fight in the first place.
Wow. Yeah.
They just agree never to talk about the people in the basement so they can pretend to be a happy family again. It's reconciliation through deliberate ignorance.
That is a very apt, chilling analogy. He abstracts the violence into a grand historical unfolding, deliberately removing the messy, demanding reality of race in order to achieve a manufactured national unity.
It's frustrating.
It is. However, the academic landscape offers a second, incredibly compelling perspective on this poem, coming from a framework known as Whitman noir.
Well, this absolutely blew my mind when I read it. The concept of the ghost black speaker. Explain how this works.
So critics like Ed Folsom suggest that we might be fundamentally misreading the poem if we automatically assume the speaker standing over the coffin is a white Whitman proxy.
Okay.
We know that during the Civil War, it was frequently Black soldiers and contrabands escaped slaves, who were assigned to the grueling grave-digging details, physically placing the white dead from both sides into coffins.
Wow, right.
What if the narrator of Reconciliation is actually a black soldier?
If you read the poem through that lens, the repetition of white face completely changes meaning. It completely flips.
It does.
It's no longer an act of racial exclusion by a white author. Instead, it captures the amazement, the macabre, newly acquired liberty of a former slave to stand safely over a dead white oppressor, kiss him, and forgive him from a position of ultimate survival.
Exact.
The shared horrifying experience of being a soldier in the mud unites them, allowing this shocking transcendent moment of reconciliation that completely subverts the racial hierarchy of the time.
It's a reading that forces us to entirely reconsider the depths of the poem. We know Whitman frequently adopted different personas in his work, and we know from his early pre-war notebooks that he actively tried to enter the minds of both the slave and the master of slaves to truly encompass the American experience.
Right.
While we don't have the original manuscript for Reconciliation to definitively prove this was his intent, the sheer possibility of an erased black presence acting as the ultimate agent of forgiveness adds a profound layer of moral complexity to his post-war ethics.
It's a brilliant reading. But, even if we embrace that interpretation, we can't ignore the historical reality that Whitman, the man, in his later years, had severe, undeniable blind spots.
Oh, absolutely.
His desperate, overwhelming need for national unity did result in him marginalizing the very people his early radical poetry championed. The radical who wrote that the grass grows equally for the congressman and the cuff eventually settled for a much more segregated view of America's future.
That is undeniably true. But, and this is the pivotal term when we discuss Whitman's ultimate legacy, despite his profound personal flaws, his political compromises, and his post-war fatigue, his poetic innovations were so incredibly powerful that they broke free of his own limitations.
That's the amazing part.
He created a linguistic toolkit that the very people he marginalized could pick up, repurpose, and use to demand their own equality.
Which brings us to how we view his legacy today. The analytical material calls him a public utility. I love that phrase.
That's perfect.
A public utility. He created an infrastructure of poetry, the long free verse lines, the expansive catalogs, the radically inclusive I that was so robust that generations of artists all over the globe could just plug into it for power and sustenance, regardless of what the inventor himself believed later in life.
We see this direct line of influence shaping the Harlem Renaissance, the Beat generation of the 1950s, and countless international modernists.
Wow.
Writers from diverse, marginalized backgrounds realized they didn't have to agree with Whitman the man to utilize Whitman the technology.
That is such a cool way to think about it.
Langston Hughes and June Jordan, for example. They recognized that while Whitman the man may have failed them by retreating into white nostalgia, Whitman the form gave them exactly the vernacular they needed to articulate their own experience.
His radically inclusive I, the voice that notoriously claims it contains multitudes, gave them the exact framework to demand their own space in the American democratic experiment.
Exactly.
Think about Langston Hughes writing the famous poem, I Too Sing America. That isn't just a poem in a vacuum. That is a direct, pointed conversation with Walt Whitman.
It absolutely is.
Is Hughes plugging into the public utility and talking back to the inventors, saying, "You forgot me in your song, but I am here, and I am the dark brother, and I am America too."
And that ultimately is the sheer genius of what Whitman built. He built talking back into the very fiber of his poetry. He explicitly told his future readers that they must justify him, that they must finish the work he started. He designed his poetry not to be an authoritarian lecture from a marble pedestal, but a dynamic, ongoing democratic exchange.
That's beautiful.
His language experiment succeeded exactly as he hoped it would, even if the ultimate results outgrew his own racial and social comforts.
Oh, I have to ask you, can we ever truly separate the genius of the divine literatus who invented this incredible democratic form from the flawed man who is perfectly willing to sweep the brutal root causes of the Civil War under the rug for the sake of a comforting national narrative?
I don't think we can separate them, and honestly, I don't think we should try.
Why not?
I think we have to hold both. We have to recognize that his poetry was so expansive it crossed oceans to inspire Pablo Neruda in Chile, Federico Garcia Lorca in Spain, and Ezra Pound in Europe. He truly did contain multitudes. The breathtakingly good, the visionary, the terrified, and the deeply flawed. He provided the indispensable framework for modern global poetry while simultaneously failing to live up to the full, radical promise of his own empathy in his later years.
Yeah.
To erase his flaws is to do exactly what he tried to do with the war, to wash it away for comfort.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, today? We've covered a massive amount of ground in this deep dive.
We really have.
We started with Whitman aggressively breaking the rigid aristocratic code of British meter to invent a fluid, organically rhythmic American language where the reader is forced to participate.
Yep.
We saw how his belief in a transcorporeal, connected universe meant the grass grew equally for everyone, binding us biologically. We followed him into the horrific, blood-soaked crucible of the Civil War hospitals, where the physical destruction of young men shattered his antebellum optimism.
It changed everything.
And we witnessed his haunting, ethically complex attempt to kiss his dead enemy and let the cosmic sisters, death and night, softly wash away the sins of a broken nation.
Whitman's vision of democracy was incredibly messy. It was inherently contradictory, and it was deeply flawed.
Yeah.
Much like the country he wrote about, and much like the history we constantly try to simplify and carve into clean marble monuments.
Exactly. And that leaves us with a lingering question inspired by the journey we've taken today. Whitman feared that the real war would never actually get into the history books.
Right.
He knew the intimate horrors he saw in those hospital tents, yet he intentionally used the metaphor of the sisters' death and night to wash away the brutal ideological truths of his era for the sake of national unity and comfort.
He chose comfort.
So look around at the historical narratives and the cultural memories being constructed today. What uncomfortable truths and what deep ideological divisions are we currently allowing to be washed away in our own desperate pursuit of national reconciliation and comfort? When we look at our own monuments, whose faces are we choosing to forget?